In tough times, our grandparents and great-grandparents knew how to make the most of what little they had. Their creativity in the kitchen didn't just keep bellies full, it created some truly delicious combinations that have been lost to time. Growing up in the 1960s in Australia, when rationing was still a recent memory and waste was unthinkable, families turned cheap staples into proper meals. These weren't just recipes, they were survival dressed up as dinner, and some of them were actually brilliant. Let's rediscover 15 forgotten budget recipes from the 1960s that have disappeared. Dripping on toast. If you know, you know. If you don't, your childhood was missing something fundamental. This was Sunday morning in Australia in the 1960s. You would wake up to the smell of last night's roast still lingering in the kitchen. Your mum would pull out that tin from the fridge, the one with the solidified fat from the lamb or beef, gone white and waxy overnight. She would spread it thick on hot toast, sprinkle it with salt, and that was breakfast. The heat from the bread melted the dripping into liquid gold. Rich, meaty, salty enough to wake you up properly. What made this special was not fancy ingredients. It was making absolutely certain nothing went to waste. That fat dripping from your Sunday roast became Monday's breakfast, Tuesday's sandwich spread, Wednesday's cooking fat. One roast could carry a family through half the week if you were smart about it. Bread and milk pudding turned stale bread into dessert through sheer determination and a bit of sugar. You would take yesterday's bread, rock hard, completely useless for sandwiches, and tear it into chunks. You would put those chunks into a pot with milk, sugar, a handful of sultanas if you had them, and maybe a dash of vanilla essence if you were feeling flash. The whole lot simmered on the stove until the bread softened and absorbed the sweetened milk, turning into something that resembled porridge, but tasted like comfort. The trick was not overcooking it. You wanted the bread pieces to still have a bit of texture, not turn into complete mush. It came out warm and sweet, with those plump sultanas scattered throughout like little treasure. This was not just using up old bread, it was proving that with a bit of milk and sugar, you could make something the kids would actually ask for. Savaloys and white sauce. Every Australian kid either loved them or pretended to, because complaining about dinner was not an option. The Savaloy, the bright red mystery sausage that came cheap from the butcher, was boiled until the skin went tight and shiny. While it cooked, you would make homemade white sauce from scratch. Butter, flour, and milk were whisked until they thickened into that pale, creamy gravy. You would serve the Savaloys whole or sliced, swimming in that white sauce, probably over mashed potato or white bread if money was particularly tight. The Savaloy had a texture somewhere between a Frankfurt and a mystery, slightly smoky, vaguely meaty, with that snap when you bit through the skin. What made this work was not the Savaloy itself. Let's be honest, nobody knew what was actually in those things. It was the sauce. Homemade white sauce turned anything into dinner. Corned beef fritters turned tinned meat into something you'd actually want to eat. Brilliant. You'd open that tin of corned beef, the one with the key that never worked properly and always left you wrestling with the metal. The beef came out in a solid pink block, held together by salt and hope. You'd mash it up with your hands, mix in mashed potato, an egg if you had one, maybe some finely chopped onion, and a bit of flour to hold it all together. Shape them into patties. Fry them in hot fat until both sides turned golden and crispy. The outside developed that proper crunch, while the inside stayed soft, salty, and rich with beef flavour. The genius was in transforming something straight from a tin into something that tasted homemade. One tin of corned beef could make 8 to 10 fritters, depending on how much potato you added. Feed a family for dinner, with enough left over for someone's lunch the next day. Potato and egg pie proved you did not need meat to make something substantial. It was layers of thinly sliced potato, cheap as dirt and available year-round, arranged in a baking dish with hard-boiled eggs cut in half and nestled between the layers. You would pour a mixture of milk and beaten egg over it, season it with salt and pepper, maybe add some cheese if you had it, and bake it until the top turned golden and the potatoes went soft. The result was creamy, filling, and surprisingly satisfying. Each slice came out showing cross-sections of egg yolk like little suns throughout the potato layers. During the 1960s, when meat was expensive but eggs and potatoes were cheap, this became a weekly staple for families stretching the grocery budget. Mock chicken. Because actual chicken was for special occasions, you could fake it with cheaper meat, and nobody really minded. This was thin veal, or sometimes pork cutlets, the cheapest cuts the butcher had, pounded even thinner, then crumbed and fried until golden. The trick was in the crumbing. You would dip each cutlet in beaten egg, then press it into breadcrumbs that you had made from stale bread. Fried in butter or dripping, these cutlets came out crispy on the outside, with that satisfying crunch when you bit through. The name mock chicken came from the way the thin, crumbed meat resembled chicken schnitzel. Or maybe it was wishful thinking. Either way, it became its own thing. 1 pound of veal could feed 4 people if you pounded it thin enough. Curried sausages. The dish that introduced most Australian kids to the idea of curry, even though it bore absolutely no resemblance to anything actually Indian. You took the cheapest sausages from the butcher and browned them in a pan. While they cooked, you made a sauce from onions, a bit of flour, water or stock, and the secret ingredient, Keen's curry powder. That yellow tin lived in every Australian pantry. A tablespoon or two turned plain gravy into curry. The sausages simmered in that sauce until they were cooked through and the gravy thickened. You served the lot over white rice, maybe with some sultanas if your family did that. But here is the thing, it worked. The curry flavour cut through the richness of the sausages. Kids who would not eat plain sausages would demolish curried ones. The whole meal cost 3 shillings and fed a family of 5. Rice pudding. The dessert that used up the cheapest pantry staples and somehow became the thing kids looked forward to. You would take short grain rice and bake it slowly with milk, sugar and sultanas in a low oven. It took hours, sometimes 3 or 4, the rice gradually absorbing the sweetened milk until it transformed into something creamy and thick. A grating of nutmeg over the top was essential. The result came out of the oven warm and comforting, with a golden skin on top that some people fought over and others carefully removed. What made this special was not the ingredients, rice, milk, sugar, sultanas. It was the time. That slow, gentle cooking transformed basic ingredients into something that felt like you had been looked after. Toad in the hole. Not the British version with sausages in Yorkshire pudding batter. The Australian version was simply an egg fried in the middle of bread. You took a slice of white bread and cut a circle out of the middle with a cup or glass. Butter the bread. Put it in a hot pan with more butter. Crack an egg into the hole. Let it fry until the white set and the yolk stayed runny, the bread turning golden and crispy around the edges. The taste was simple. Butter, bread, egg. But the combination worked. The crispy bread soaked up the runny yolk. 1 egg, 1 slice of bread, a bit of butter. 20 cents worth of ingredients, maximum. During tough weeks, when the grocery money ran out before payday, Toad in the hole kept people fed without making them feel like they were scraping the barrel. Bubble and Squeak turned Sunday's leftovers into Monday's dinner, and nobody complained. This was everything left over from the roast: mashed potato, cabbage, peas, carrots, sometimes Brussels sprouts if someone had made them. You would mash it all together, form it into patties, and fry them in the leftover fat from the roast. The name came from the sound they made while cooking, the bubbling and squeaking as the moisture evaporated and the vegetables caramelized. The outside turned crispy and golden, almost like a hash brown. The genius was in using absolutely everything. That cabbage nobody wanted to finish at dinner. Now it is part of bubble and squeak. One Sunday roast could give you Monday's bubble and squeak, Tuesday's cold meat sandwiches, Wednesday's soup from the bones, and Thursday's dripping on toast. Nothing wasted. Everything used. Condensed milk slice. The dessert that proved you didn't need fancy ingredients to make something people would actually request. The base was crushed Arnott's biscuits, usually Marie or Nice biscuits, mixed with melted butter and pressed into a tray. The filling was sweetened condensed milk, cocoa, more melted butter, and coconut, all mixed together and spread over the base. Then it went into the refrigerator until it set firm enough to slice. The result was rich and dense. What made this special was how little actual cooking it required. No oven, no stovetop beyond melting butter, just mixing and waiting. Perfect for summer when you didn't want to heat up the kitchen. During the 1960s, this became the go-to recipe for school fetes, church socials, and unexpected visitors. Stewed tripe and onions. The dish that separated people who grew up poor from people who just thought they did. Tripe, that's cow's stomach lining, came cheap from the butcher because most people did not want it. You would cut it into strips and stew it slowly with onions, milk, salt, and pepper until it went tender. The tripe had a texture unlike anything else. Tender but slightly chewy, with a honeycomb pattern that soaked up the milky sauce. People who loved it, loved it. People who hated it, really hated it. There was no middle ground with tripe. But during the 1960s, when it cost about a quarter of what regular beef cost, families who needed cheap protein made their peace with it. The trick was the slow cooking. Rush it, and the tripe stayed tough and rubbery. Give it time, and it transformed into something tender enough to cut with a fork. Bread and butter pudding turned stale bread into dessert with such dignity that you would forget you were eating leftovers. You would take yesterday's bread, slice it, butter it, and layer it in a baking dish. Sprinkle sultanas between the layers. Mix eggs, milk, and sugar into a custard. Pour it over the bread until every slice was soaked. Then bake until the top went golden and slightly crispy, while the bottom stayed soft and custardy. The top pieces of bread turned almost caramelized. The bottom pieces dissolved into rich custard. What started as poverty and a refusal to waste stale bread became something people actively wanted to eat. During the 1960s, when throwing out food was practically sinful, bread and butter pudding became the honourable solution to the stale bread problem. Mince and peas on toast. The meal that happened when you were too tired for anything complicated, but still needed to feed people. You would brown the cheapest mince you could get in a pan with diced onions. Add a tin of peas, liquid and all. Season with salt and pepper. Let it simmer until it thickened into a sauce. Toast some bread. Pile the mince mixture on top. Dinner. What made this work was speed and simplicity. 20 minutes from start to finish. 3 ingredients beyond salt and pepper. The genius was in using the liquid from the tinned peas as part of the sauce. That sweet pea water helped stretch the mince and created the gravy that made the whole thing work. Mock cream. Because real cream was expensive, and you didn't need it anyway when you could make this. You would take equal parts butter and sugar and beat them together with a wooden spoon until they turned pale and fluffy. The sugar dissolved into the butter, creating something that looked almost like whipped cream, but tasted richer and sweeter. It got spread on sponge cakes, dolloped on scones, and sandwiched between biscuits. During the 1960s, when fresh cream was a luxury most families couldn't justify, mock cream became the default choice for any cake or dessert that needed a topping. The kids didn't know the difference. The adults knew, but didn't care, because it was cheaper and lasted longer. These recipes fed families through the toughest times Australia has seen. The trick was not fancy ingredients or complicated techniques. It was making do with what you had and finding dignity in simplicity. For those with memories of eating these dishes, there is always more history to explore. What comes to mind when you think of cooking in the 1960s in Australia? I would love to hear your memories in the comments. And if you enjoyed this little trip back in time, do not forget to subscribe for more nostalgic content coming your way.